In public, Adolf Hitler appeared to be an unshakable symbol of discipline and iron will. His voice rang out from the podium. He marched to the sound of fanfare, and millions of German citizens saw in him the living embodiment of the national idea. But behind this carefully constructed facade lurked a man whose private life was shrouded in a veil of secrecy, controlled by Nazi propaganda. The Führer's inner circle did everything to divert attention from his eccentricities, his shattered emotional world, and his paranoid fears. Those who were close enough to Hitler to peer behind the curtain of his image found not a sovereign leader, but a man who was eternally doubtful, capricious, sometimes childish, and morbidly concerned with his appearance and his own perception in the eyes of others. One of the key elements of Hitler's private life was isolation. He avoided ordinary social interactions, had few friends in the traditional sense of the word, and trusted no one unless absolutely necessary. His day was planned down to the minute, and all the details of everyday life, from the temperature in the room to what food was served to him, was subject to strict control. He woke up late, often after midday, ate breakfast alone, and began meetings in the late afternoon. His rhythm of life was completely out of sync with the rhythms of his generals and comrades, but no one dared point this out. Many suspected that this was not just a personal whim, but symptoms of a deep psychological disorder. Hitler's mental health became a subject of particular interest among historians and psychiatrists already during World War II. In 1943, a secret report was compiled by order of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, which claimed that Hitler suffered from persecution mania, sadomasochistic tendencies, and possible signs of schizophrenia. The authors of the document claimed that the leader of the Third Reich was incapable of normal human relationships, subject to outbursts of rage and mood instability. Even at that time, it was clear that his image as a leader did not correspond to his inner world, full of anxiety and a constant need to confirm his own exceptionalism. His relationships with women were also full of contradictions. Hitler carefully concealed his personal life from the public, trying to maintain the image of an ascetic and untouchable leader, completely devoted to the cause of the nation. Nazi propaganda even spread the claim that he was married to Germany. Nevertheless, he had love affairs, the most famous of which was with Eva Braun, a young woman who lived in his entourage for many years. However, their relationship remained secret until the very end of the war. Even the Führer's closest aides were not always aware of the role Eva played in his life. He did not invite her to official events, did not allow her into political discussions, and essentially kept her in a golden cage. Such secrecy often led to rumors, sometimes extremely strange. Some claimed that Hitler was impotent, others that he practiced perverted forms of sex, and still others that he had homosexual tendencies that were carefully hidden by the Nazi elite. Despite the lack of direct evidence, these rumors point to something important. His sexuality and intimate life remained a closed topic, surrounded by many restrictions and strange rituals. His closeness to women was often accompanied by control, jealousy, and manipulation. He could end a relationship with a girlfriend because of her independent statements or because, in his opinion, she was behaving not modestly enough. Another trait that reflected Hitler's inner world was his obsession with cleanliness and health. He watched his diet, avoided alcohol, did not smoke, and also spoke out sharply against meat. Although he was not a strict vegetarian all his life, by the time the war began, he had almost completely eliminated meat from his diet. This was accompanied by regular medication, some of which was prescribed by his personal physician Theodor Morell, a man whose methods are still controversial. Morell supplied Hitler with a mixture of stimulants, vitamins, sedatives, and even drugs, including methamphetamines. This dependence on medical intervention only increased the Führer's isolation from reality. Hitler's everyday habits often amazed those around him. He spent hours watching silent films, adored Wagner's operas, and could suddenly interrupt a conversation to talk about a scene from a play. Music played a huge role in his life. He found solace and inspiration in it, but also an opportunity to hide from the world. In the circle of his close associates, he turned into a different person. He could be cheerful, even playful, tell jokes, laugh, but it always seemed forced. The mood swings were abrupt. After a few hours he could fall into a gloomy silence, withdraw into himself, and not even talk to his personal adjutant. In personal relationships, he was authoritarian to the extreme. Even in small matters, he demanded obedience and absolute loyalty. His adjutants, secretaries, and maids knew that the slightest deviation from the established rules could cause a storm of indignation. He did not tolerate arguments and perceived any disagreement as betrayal. At the same time, he was extremely dependent on praise and attention. He sought confirmation of his genius and uniqueness, and if he did not receive it, he would fall into a rage or withdraw into himself. These emotional swings turned the life of his closest circle into a constant game of survival. Interest in esotericism and mysticism also became part of his inner world. Hitler believed in omens, horoscopes, prophecies. He often consulted astrologers and fortune tellers, especially during difficult periods. Some historians claim that he was strongly influenced by the ideas of Aryan superiority, occultism, and ancient Germanic mythology. These beliefs fed his delusions of grandeur and fueled his paranoia. He considered himself the chosen one, a missionary sent by fate for a great purpose. This worldview left no room for doubt, remorse, or critical examination of his actions. The Führer's inner circle, from Bormann to Himmler, were well aware of how unstable their leader was. But instead of curbing his impulses, they learned to exploit them. Some strengthened their positions by flattering his ego, some played into his manias, and some created a cult atmosphere around him. Thus, little by little, Hitler lost the ability to perceive reality and became a prisoner of his own myth, cut off from the real world, but completely absorbed in the illusion he had created. Hitler was especially concerned about the possibility of being killed. He obsessively looked for signs of fate in small things. For example, he could cancel a trip because of an unfavorable star or order negotiations to be postponed if the astrological calendar considered the day unfavorable. Such actions are surprising, especially given the image of a rational leader that he cultivated publicly. In fact, Hitler made the most important state decisions, including those related to the outbreak of war, under the influence of such ideas. No less remarkable was the fascination of the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler with esotericism. He sought to turn the SS into an order of knights of a new Aryan religion, inspired by ancient Germanic cults. Himmler built a magic center in Wolfsburg, where rituals dedicated to the Aryan gods were held. Hitler was skeptical about such extremes, but did not interfere. On the contrary, he allowed such initiatives to develop, since they corresponded to his conviction about the special mission of the German nation and his own exceptionalism as a conductor of this mission. Hitler often returned to the thought that his life was miraculously protected. He claimed that during World War I, a bullet turned away from him while he was under heavy fire. Similarly, he interpreted the failed assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, at the Wolfslair headquarters as a sign of fate, claiming that he survived thanks to higher intervention. These beliefs fueled his paranoia. He became increasingly withdrawn, refusing to meet with his closest comrades, limiting his social circle, and spending more and more time alone with his thoughts, trying to guess his fate. Hitler's entourage played a key role in shaping his everyday reality. These people not only ensured the dictator's comfort and safety, but also served as a kind of filter between him and the outside world. Adjutants, guards, personal physician, cooks, maids and secretaries were carefully selected, checked, and were required to show absolute loyalty. Any leak of information or violation of internal etiquette was punishable by immediate dismissal, Most of them were immersed in a constant state of anxiety, because the Führer's mood changed unpredictably. No one knew what could cause a burst of rage: improperly served tea, an accidentally opened window, or simply silence at the wrong moment. Behind the outer mask of a cold-blooded dictator was a man who was corroded by internal fears, manias and obsessions. One of the most characteristic features of Hitler's psyche was his obsessive need to control his own body, health and the surrounding space. This need often took grotesque forms and reached pathological conditions. The Führer's closest circle, from his personal physician Theodor Morell to his adjutants, witnessed numerous episodes when Hitler's internal anxieties caused paranoid reactions and strange behavior. An obsession with cleanliness was one of these traits. Hitler monitored his personal hygiene with manic persistence, and could not stand dust, dirt, or smells. He not only took a daily bath and brushed his teeth several times a day, but also demanded that all objects around him be thoroughly washed and sterilized. Entire services monitored this in the Wolfschanz and Berghof. Personal cooks and servants were regularly checked, and their uniforms had to be impeccably clean. Even the doors and handles in his residences were wiped with disinfectant solutions several times a day. The Führer experienced a pathological fear of germs and diseases. He avoided touching, refused to shake hands, and abruptly broke off contact with anyone he thought might be sick. This phobia worsened over the years. In the last years of his life, he practically isolated himself from the outside world, allowing only a limited circle of people to see him, who underwent strict filtration. In the office of his personal physician, Theodor Morell, there were entire cabinets with medications, including experimental drugs, which he regularly administered to Hitler. There is documentary evidence that Hitler suffered from severe gastrointestinal disorders, accompanied by constant pain, bloating, and flatulence. He took many drugs, including barbiturates, opiates, laxatives, and special herbal infusions, which ultimately only worsened his condition. Morell prescribed him incredible doses of medications, sometimes up to 20 different drugs a day. This led to addiction and chronic intoxication, which affected not only the physical, but also the mental state of the Führer. In addition, Hitler suffered from chronic insomnia. He could not fall asleep without strong sleeping pills and sometimes stayed awake for 2 or 3 days, experiencing hallucinations, panic attacks and paranoia. He was afraid of being poisoned and did not trust even those who had been around him for decades. He often demanded that his food be tested on himself by tasters, and then waited a certain amount of time before eating. This fear was especially acute after the assassination attempt in July 1944. Some of Hitler's intimate habits were equally strange. According to those who worked in his residences, he spent hours alone, locked in the bathroom or bedroom, without explanation. He could not stand the smell of tobacco and forbade smoking in all the rooms where he was. Even guests arriving on diplomatic missions had to abstain completely from smoking. The Führer was suspicious of any medical care. He would suddenly refuse to take his medication, believing that doctors were trying to control him. At the same time, he blindly trusted Morell, despite constant complaints from other members of the entourage, who considered him a charlatan. Because of Morell's interference, even Eva Braun did not have access to information about the true state of Hitler's health. Hitler's personal physician, Theodor Morell, occupied perhaps the most unique position among the dictator's close associates. He had unlimited access to the dictator's body and health, and over the years became almost indispensable. Morell treated Hitler for stomach problems, flatulence, insomnia, leg pain, anxiety, but his methods were questioned even by other members of the staff. He administered dozens of drugs to the Führer, many of which were either experimental or simply dangerous. Among them were stimulants, barbiturates, injections of animal origin, and methamphetamines. Hitler gradually became a drug addict, but he continued to trust Morell even when his health began to deteriorate noticeably. Bormann and other associates tried to get rid of the doctor, considering him a charlatan, but each time the Führer stood up for Morell, declaring that only he knew how to deal with him. One of the strangest aspects of the inner circle was the almost theatrical atmosphere that reigned in the private headquarters. Dinner with the Führer turned into a ritual. Employees had to sit in a certain order, not interrupt, and listen attentively to his monologues. Conversations during meals most often concerned art, architecture, animals, vegetarianism, and, less often, politics. Hitler could talk 4 hours about how Berlin should be rebuilt, describe in great detail the facades of the buildings he wanted to build, or recall scenes from Wagner operas. His obsession with architectural projects was astonishing. He paid attention to the smallest details, checked drawings, discussed compositions, and often ignored military reports if they interfered with his thoughts. The Führer suffered from severe suspiciousness. He could not stand smells, suspected those around him of conspiracies, and was terrified of being poisoned. All dishes for him were checked by tasters, and his personal china and cutlery were carefully guarded. After the unsuccessful assassination attempt in July 1944, paranoia reached its peak. He began to avoid open spaces, tightened security measures, and limited access to his chambers. Even his closest associates could wait for several hours before they were allowed into the reception room. His nocturnal habits became stronger. He worked until late at night, made decisions alone, not allowing anyone to come to him until he had finished his thoughts. Hitler had no real friends. Those who were nearby were more like tools than close people. He exploited their loyalty, and then alienated or destroyed them at the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. For example, his relationship with Rudolf Hess, with whom he had an almost brotherly closeness, ended abruptly after Hess's sudden flight to Great Britain in 1941. Hitler perceived this as a betrayal, despite Hess's many years of loyalty. After this incident, he became even more withdrawn, and any manifestation of initiative on the part of his comrades caused anxiety. The feeling of his own uniqueness and mission fueled his megalomania. He seriously believed that he had an exceptional destiny, that history owed him endless attention. He could spend hours looking at his photographs, listening to recordings of his own speeches, reviewing newsreels from rallies. He needed constant confirmation that he was great. This revealed a deep insecurity. He did not tolerate criticism, even constructive. Anything that did not fit his vision of the world was declared wrong, harmful, or in the case of advice from general sabotage. The Führer's secretaries, including Traudl Jung and Christa Schroeder, later described life next to him in their memoirs as a mixture of horror and strange charm. He could be charming, polite, even attentive to small details, giving gifts, inquiring about health, joking, but this was always replaced by alienation. Secretaries had no right to ask about politics. They had to behave as if invisible, carry out orders precisely, without asking unnecessary questions. It was especially difficult during periods of depression, when Hitler withdrew, walked in circles, muttered under his breath, or sat in a chair, staring at one point. Paranoia even extended to personal belongings. He was afraid that he would be outwitted, documents stolen, conversations overheard. Special insulation panels were installed in the office and bedroom, and all papers were destroyed according to a strict schedule. He trusted only a few people, and even their phones were checked for wiretaps. He could throw a tantrum if he saw something out of place. Books, glasses, pencils, everything had to be in a strictly defined way. In this way, he tried to maintain a sense of control over the surrounding chaos. In communication, he avoided spontaneity. Even toasts and jokes were often thought out in advance. Everything had to make an impression to support his image. He played a role, not only for the public, but also for himself. Sometimes he created the feeling that he lived not in the present time, but in some imaginary space where everything was subordinated to his ideas. He made up versions of events, that he believed in himself. His past was constantly rewritten. In stories, he became increasingly heroic, and failures were carefully hushed up. Even in his relationship with Eva Braun, he did not seek real intimacy. Their union was built on inequality and subordination. Eva lived alone, taking photographs, dancing, and taking walks, while Hitler was busy with state affairs. He hardly discussed politics with her, did not share his experiences, that did not allow her to leave him. She had no right to appear at official receptions, did not sign documents, did not participate in negotiations. Their wedding, which took place the day before his suicide, looked more like a gesture of formal recognition of her sacrifice than an expression of love. With the outbreak of war, Adolf Hitler's personal life finally turned into a carefully guarded fortress, where only a select few had access. The level of secrecy reached the absurd. The Führer's movements were classified until the hour of departure. The routes were guarded by repeatedly checked SS units, and even his closest circle often found out his location after the fact. Special residences were built for Hitler: the Berghof in Obersalzberg, the Wolfschanz in East Prussia, the Vorbunker in Berlin. These places turned into closed worlds, where the dictator could act according to his own rules, not subject to the usual laws of time, logic or common sense. Everything that happened within these walls was subject to his inner state and whims. Hitler felt especially comfortable in the Berghof. There he spent hours sitting in a chair, looking out over the Alps, socializing with a small circle of people, mostly personal assistants, military personnel, and Eva Braun. On the surface, it looked idyllic: manicured gardens, tea parties, watching films, discussing books. But behind the facade, there was isolation, tension, and a constant sense of threat. He rarely left the residence unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, the entire operation of movement was worked out to the minute. His paranoia reached such proportions that each driver had to undergo a psychological check, and sometimes 3 different cars were prepared for one route to confuse potential conspirators. In everyday life, Hitler was obsessed with order. He did not tolerate dirt, chaos, and unpredictability. Even when he was on the move, his room had to be furnished in a strictly defined way. Books, curtains, bed linen, everything corresponded to a fixed standard. Any deviation caused a fit of irritation. The staff trained 4 weeks before they were given access to the Führer's quarters. The maids were not allowed to engage in dialogue with him unless he initiated the conversation himself. They knew that the slightest mistake, a stain on the tablecloth to hot tea, the wrong temperature in the room, could be grounds for dismissal. Hitler had persistent phobias, especially the fear of illness. He was terrified of germs and infection, regularly washed his hands, disinfected objects, and demanded that his entourage do the same. He strictly controlled his diet, especially during the war years, when he returned to a nearly complete vegetarian diet. Food was prepared separately for him, and special tasters, mostly women working at the Wolfschanz, tried them before they were served. After the failed assassination attempt with an explosive device in July 1944, which almost cost him his life, the precautions were further tightened. He stopped trusting many members of his entourage, distanced himself from the generals, and practically never left the confines of his bunkers. Hitler sank deeper and deeper into his own inner world, where art, politics, mysticism, and illusions merged. Music played a colossal role in his life. Richard Wagner's operas became for him just an aesthetic pleasure, but part of his philosophical and even religious worldview. He saw Wagner's music as the embodiment of the spirit of the German race, heroism, and destiny. These motives influenced not only his worldview, but also his way of thinking. He often quoted scenes from operas, saw parallels between himself and mythological characters. Musical evenings at the Berghof or the bunker were accompanied by long monologues about the importance of art in the fate of nations, about the role of genius in history. Those around him listened silently, afraid to interrupt the flow of thoughts, which could easily be replaced by a sharp change in mood. His behavior in a small circle was distinguished by sharp contrasts. He could be unexpectedly friendly, tell jokes, share memories of his youth, but then suddenly fall into depression, become silent and become unavailable. Sometimes he went to the bedroom for a day, refused to eat, did not answer knocks on the door. His emotional instability only increased over the years. He became irritable, did not tolerate noise well, avoided light and crowds. He even lost interest in cinema shows, which he used to love. Most often, he watched old German silent films or documentaries with his own performances, sometimes several times in a row. Eva Braun stayed by his side, even though their relationship was far from warm. She filled her time with shopping, sports, photography, and a personal diary. Eva's notes contain many hints of loneliness and misunderstanding. She suffered from a lack of attention, complained that the Führer was distant, closed, and perceived her as part of the interior. Nevertheless, she did not leave him. Perhaps she believed in a special place in Hitler's life, or she was simply afraid of the consequences of a breakup. At any moment, she could be sent away and forgotten. He controlled her as he controlled everything else in his life. Hitler's relationships with his personal staff were also built on fear and submission. His bodyguards from the Leibstandarte SS, Adolf Hitler knew, a step to the left, a word off script, an inappropriate joke, and you could be fired without explanation. Even high-ranking officers did not feel safe. When Rommel came under suspicion of involvement in a conspiracy, Hitler showed no sympathy. He offered him suicide as a form of honor. This approach to people was widespread. The Führer had no friends, only executors of his will. Many in his circle led a double life. They outwardly agreed with everything he said, but among themselves discussed his inadequacy, mistrust, oddities. However, no one dared to speak out against him. Everyone knew that the price for disagreement could be too high, especially in the last years of the war, when Hitler's isolation became absolute, and access to him was strictly filtered by Martin Bormann. He controlled the paper flow, decided who would be admitted to the reception, and effectively turned into a gatekeeper to the dictator's body. The cult of personality created around Hitler began to crumble by the end of the war. Even in the SS and the Wehrmacht, there was a growing understanding that the leader had become detached from reality. His orders became illogical, his strategies destructive, his speech confused. He no longer listened to his generals, making decisions based on intuition, often ignoring reports. His inner circle became a zone of absolute submission, but not respect. Many expected his downfall, but continued to play along, hoping to maintain their own positions. When World War II entered its phase of defeats, Adolf Hitler's personal isolation reached its limit. He almost completely stopped appearing in public, avoided frontline trips, and limited contacts even with his closest generals. His main abode became the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the Vorbunker. It was a gloomy, closed, concrete labyrinth, hidden underground, where daylight did not penetrate. Within these walls, the Führer lived the last months of his life, completely cut off from reality. His routine became extremely unstable. He slept during the day, was awake at night, held meetings closer to midnight, sometimes without warning, forcing officers to wait 4 hours to be called. He became indifferent to food. He ate almost nothing, and the amount of medication administered by Morrell only increased. Injections became a daily practice, and the dictator's body no longer responded to stimulants as before. Hitler's mental and physical condition deteriorated sharply. His hands began to tremble. He had problems with speech. He lost weight, and he had poor coordination. He began to walk with his head down. He slouched. He could barely lift his legs. Witnesses noted that he looked like an old man, although he was not even 60 years old. At times, he lost his composure. He threw objects, screamed, became hysterical, accusing everyone around him of betrayal. Even the most loyal employees began to realize that they were not dealing with a great leader, but a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He repeated the same accusations over and over again, refused to accept reality, and listened to reports that spoke of the catastrophic situation at the front. His belief in final victory was replaced by a fanatical desire to die with the illusion of a winner. One of his most frightening traits was his obsession with betrayal. He was convinced that everyone around him was a potential enemy. After the failure of Operation Valkyrie, when German officers tried to kill him with an explosive device, his paranoia reached its extreme. He suspected even those who had been with him for decades. He dismissed field marshals, generals, adjutants and diplomats, accusing them of treason, cowardice and sabotage. Many were executed or forced to commit suicide. The room in the bunker where he compiled the blacklists became a place where people were afraid to enter. His signature on an order meant a death sentence. He did not hesitate, did not look for evidence, did not listen to explanations. A rumor or a personal impression was enough. The relationship with Eva Braun entered a strange phase of quiet acceptance during this period. She voluntarily came to Berlin in the last weeks of the war, fully aware of how it would all end. Her presence became a symbol of devotion, but also of tragic doom. Hitler hardly spoke to her, but allowed her to be near. From time to time, they watched old films, listened to music, drank wine. The last days before his death passed in an almost surreal atmosphere, an underground world surrounded by the noise of artillery strikes, interrupted by everyday trifles, breakfasts, reading newspapers, handing out chocolate to the guards. Eva behaved as if nothing was happening, even doing her hair and dressing up as if she were getting ready for a ball. Perhaps this was a form of denial, or a last attempt to maintain the illusion of normality. By the beginning of 1945, Hitler had completely withdrawn into himself. He almost never left the bunker under the Reich Chancellery, suffered from insomnia and fits of rage. In an attempt to control what was happening, he increasingly resorted to turning to prophecies. According to the memoirs of Oberleutnant Gerhard Bohm, once in the bunker Hitler angrily crossed out maps of the front, claiming that fate is fickle, and it was necessary to wait until the stars are right. Even though the Allied army had already stormed Berlin, he believed in the possibility of a miracle. One of the most striking episodes was his last meeting with the astrologer Ludwig Hansen. This event was never fully confirmed, but is mentioned in several memoirs. Allegedly, Hitler asked him in April 1945 to name a date favorable for a new beginning. Hansen replied, "The path to another world awaits you, Führer. It is liberation." These words plunged Hitler into silence, after which he left the room and did not leave for a long time. A few days later, he committed suicide. Along with mysticism, the fear of betrayal grew. After the failure with Rommel, suspicions of treason among the generals, and conspiracies in the entourage, Hitler finally lost trust in anyone. He did not trust anyone, not Eva Braun, not his adjutant Julius Schorp, not his personal doctor Theodor Morell. He was afraid that he could be poisoned, and refused food prepared by new cooks. It is known that in his last days he ate only dishes prepared by vegetarian cooks, and drank water from special vessels to exclude the possibility of poison. He even changed his guards daily, so that no one would get used to it. Isolation, control mania, and fatalism became the main features of the last months of the dictator's life. He increasingly spoke of fate, inevitability and karma, emphasizing that everything has already been decided. These words came from the lips of a man who had recently been coldly calculating in his destruction of millions and dictating terms to the world. His belief in mysticism did not save him from the horror of his own death. In his final hours, he found himself alone, locked in a dungeon, behind whose walls the world he had built was collapsing. Perhaps this is the most terrible irony of all. A man who sought to control everything found himself completely helpless in the face of the reality he had created. The bunker became a symbol of Hitler's personal downfall. He locked himself in a space that reflected his inner state: darkness, concrete, isolation, fear. Almost never going outside, he increasingly talked to himself, reread his own speeches, listened to old recordings. His world became cyclical: reports, hysterics, accusations, silence. He increasingly turned to mystical reflections. He recalled prophecies, horoscopes, historical analogies. At times, he would claim that fate would still turn around, or the German people were not worthy of him. Such statements shocked even his most loyal subordinates. But no one dared to argue. He had become a shadow of himself, surrounded by a gloomy routine and general fear. The suicide plan had been discussed since early April 1945. Hitler made no secret of his intention to avoid falling into enemy hands. He had seen Mussolini's life end. His body hung by his feet in the square. This had deeply shaken him and confirmed his idea that death should be controlled, theatrical, and staged according to his own scenario. He ordered the preparation of ampoules of potassium cyanide, a loaded pistol, and discussed the procedure with his adjutants. He even staged a kind of rehearsal. He called in doctors, tested the ampoules, insisted on testing the effectiveness of the poison on dogs, including his favorite, the German Shepherd Blondie. The death of the animal convinced him that the poison was working. It was an act of extreme cruelty, but in Hitler's logic, it was a way to make sure that the plan would work. On April 29th, he officially married Eva Braun. The wedding took place in the bunker, in the presence of several witnesses. It was a formal act, devoid of emotion. The next morning, they committed suicide together. Eva took poison. Hitler shot himself. Their bodies were burned according to a predetermined order, so that the Allies could not desecrate them. It was the end of a life, completely controlled by the dictator until the last moments. He did not allow fate to dispose of him. Even in death, he wanted to remain the master of the situation. The remnants of his personal circle were paralyzed. Adjutants, guards, secretaries did not know what to do. On the one hand, orders had to be followed. On the other, everything lost its meaning. Bormann tried to organize a breakout from Berlin, but almost no one survived. The rest either surrendered or committed suicide. The story of Hitler's personal life ended in a chamber of fear and darkness, in the cold and smoke, surrounded by those who no longer believed in victory, or in the idea, or in the Führer himself. Hitler's life ended in a closed space, fenced off from the world, where time, logic, and common sense disappeared. He began as an agitator dreaming of recognition, became a dictator who achieved total control, and died in isolation, hunted by his own fears. His path is the path of a man who lost contact with reality and built an illusory world around himself in which there was no truth, no compassion, no love left.